Welcome to the Miracle Hill podcast, where we share raw stories and have honest conversations that display the anatomy of God's grace here at Miracle Hill Ministries. We hope that these conversations uplift, encourage, inspire, and deepen your walk of faith, and expand your compassion for the last, the least, and the lost. Welcome back to the Miracle Hill podcast. On our last episode, we spoke with Young Ghun about real change in recovery. Instead of talking about his own story and past, we focused more on his present and how he helps people now. Young's story is one that we documented at length in a prior episode, and we thought it would be a great time to reshare that story so that all can see just how much God can radically change a life. Enjoy this recast of Young's story from 2022.
Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking to Young. We're going to be talking about his story and his experience and listen to how Jesus was weaved through his existence. Spoiler alert, you know the Lord. That's a good thing.
Yes, that's the best thing. It's the only thing, really,
Right.
that I do know at this point. I feel a little, am I allowed to tell everybody this is like our inaugural podcast? Is that too much information?
Yeah, they may not be listening to it as number one, but This is the first one that we are recording.
I feel a little bit like that chimp that gets sent out to space first. You know what I'm saying? So I am excited to be here. I love to talk about Jesus, and thanks for having me.
Great. So we want to start off with just like pretend like we just met at a coffee shop.
Okay.
And you've got to tell me who you are in 2 sentences. Who are you?
Who am I? I am a disciple of Jesus. I am someone who lives in recovery, and I work for Miracle Hill, though. I am the resident support at the Spartanburg Rescue Mission. We have a transitional living home there called Copperline, and I'm a Bob Jones student. I'm a son. I'm a brother, and I am I don't know. That's a really, I guess that's an existential question that I always have a difficult time answering when everyone says, "Who are you?" And I'm like, well, that's a very challenging question, but it shouldn't be. But mostly I am someone who probably shouldn't be here and is so grateful to be here every day.
That is a great lead in.
Yeah.
Right? You shouldn't be here, but you are.
Yes.
So we want to start by saying that we're thankful that you are.
Oh, thank you.
But we want to start from the beginning. So where'd you grow up? What was your childhood like?
So I had a childhood that was very much the immigrant experience. So my mom and my dad both at some point moved, and I came here to America at different times, and then they met. And when we came here, I was born in New Jersey, and our whole thing was we moved a lot as a child. We were just in survival mode all the time. We were trying to make things work, but we were a really close family. And growing up, I had a younger brother and a younger sister, and it was me and my mom. And it was a good childhood, but it was a bit of a tumultuous one. At some point, my father, he got arrested for some white collar kind of activities in the 80s. And so he went to prison actually when I was in the 2nd grade. And so what should have been this really tumultuous time in my life, actually it was a really interesting time because it was the first time that I met Jesus. I didn't really know him back then. I think I've wrestled with this question, like, did I accept him in my life? Was he someone? But the truth is that, like, I went to church a lot as a kid. I lived near my grandmother while my father was in prison. And for most of my childhood, from like 2nd grade to 6th grade, 7th grade, I was very much a church-going kid who was doing his best to make it in this world. It was challenging being sort of the Korean kid, because I lived all over. I lived in Colorado, I lived in Alabama, I lived in different places, and I always felt a little bit like the green alien walking down the street. Like, so if you saw a green alien, some people would be scared of the green alien, and some people would sort of run up and go, "Green alien, what's going on?" So I always felt a little other than or outside of then. But for the most part, it was a pretty good upbringing. At some point, my father came back into the picture when I was in 6th grade, and that had a really, really specific effect on my life. I didn't realize that my relationship with my earthly father was going to not forever, but for the majority of my life, affect my relationship with my heavenly Father and my understanding of the world, my worldview. And so, I don't know. It's the best way to sum up that.
Who was the driver to get you to church? You said you started going to church, and you were going. You also said this was about the time that your grandmother lived nearby.
Yes. So So my father goes to prison, and we don't know what we're going to do. We don't know what we're going to do for money. We don't know what we're going to do, how we're going to survive. And so we moved to Colorado Springs, Colorado, to be near my grandmother. Sort of, she was going to help, raise us through this. She had a job, and at a factory actually, and she was just like the most amazing woman. She had managed to survive the North Koreans, and during the Korean War, she had really brought all of her family and all of her children over here to America. But she was not a believer. And so my mom growing up, she was someone, I think at some point when she was Catholic, but then she converted to Christianity. And so she just knew that she needed help raising her 2 boys at the time. It was just me and my brother. And so she started taking us to church, and I went to a church in Colorado Springs. I went to 2 churches. I went to First Presbyterian Church in downtown Colorado Springs, and I went to a Korean church. I think it was a Korean Baptist church. So I had this really interesting upbringing in these 2 different cultures. So on Wednesday night, I would go to my Presbyterian church, and I would sing in the choir, and I would play handbells, and I met so many wonderful people that way. And then on Sunday mornings, I would go to this Korean church, and I would listen to a translator, translate the word that was being spoken in Korean. And so I was getting a lot of people who were trying to sow into me and trying to introduce me to Jesus. So I had a lot of information about who Jesus was in multiple languages, in multiple cultures, and I had a lot of stability in the people that I was hanging out with. So in that respect, that section of my life, which could have been, this terrible time where my family's going through such a challenging conflict, ended up being a really stable part of my life. I mean, I got good grades. I very much wanted to please my mom. I very much wanted to be the oldest son. The family we called the number 1 son in the Asian culture, So it's like I very much, my identity was in being the best grandson I could be, the best son I could be, the best church member I could be. It was a tough time, and so I just really tried to be sort of the perfect student.
So, and then your dad shows back up.
My dad shows back up, which is the greatest, right? When you anybody's ever experienced that, being away from a parent and a parent coming back, he comes back into the picture. But he was very much not a believer in Jesus, and to this day, he is someone that I'm having conversations with about now, about, well, what do you believe? And so his whole thing was he was trying to get reestablished. He started moving us around a bunch, and weirdly, my love for him became sort of this guiding principle. At that point, I very much wanted the attention and affection of my father. It was like, well, who do I think I have to be to earn and deserve his love? And so I worked really hard on that for about 25 years.
I think I've heard that 1,000 times,
yeah.
That we often get our first understanding of who our heavenly Father is from our understanding of who our earthly father is, good or bad, right? So if your father is a disciplinarian, then you view God as a disciplinarian. If your father is very loving, and that's just psychological, right?
Sure.
It's the association. Do you think that's true in your story?
I think it's absolutely true. I think it even goes back further. So, it's hard to see something unless it's modeled for you, to have, when you're a child, you're the sponge, right? And you pick up on things, and you don't even realize that like the culture that is around you, your worldview is being built, right? And so the other part of it is like how my dad interacted with the world and how he continues to interact with the world, and how my dad defined this world that we were in was the definition that I was going to first and foremost learn about, like, is there a God? Who God is? Why does it matter? Why does it matter that there is a God? What is important? What my priorities should be? So at a very early age, I'm seeing things through his lens. Number one, because I love him, and because I want him to love me, and I want him to respect me, and I want to, the things that are important to him are important to me, right? So the first and foremost, like, you just sort of align with the, if you're a baby duck, you're just going to follow the, the adult duck. Right. And so you're just going to kind of follow along. So first and foremost, that happens. But then in that, because we're all broken people, his brokenness is bumping up against my brokenness. And it's so interesting because isn't it interesting how God created the role of the Father, though, and how he explains it in the Bible as Abba Father, and explains it to us so way we can understand good or bad. And I don't know, it's so interesting.
So a question of ignorance here. What are the predominant religions or faith backgrounds in the area that they came from in Korea?
Okay, so Korea at this point now is, and I know very little with this myself, but I always say I'm an amateur Asian. Like, I was Korean at some point. I was born that way, but then I sort of grew up on McDonald's and cartoons, but I do know that Korea is like the most Christian nation. South Korea is the most Christian nation in the world, which is interesting because North Korea is probably one of the least Christian nations in the world. But I do know they grew up with a heavy Catholic tradition. Maybe before that they were into different kinds of Buddhism, but a lot of that was forced by the occupation of different countries. So Korea's history is interesting because of its proximity to China and Japan. Over the years, different countries have come in and basically occupied Korea. And so it's just interesting melting pot. But I think it's a wonderful example of how once the truth came in, which is Jesus, like, whew, that whole country is basically on fire for Jesus. It's one of the most, it's one of the places that sends out the most missionaries. It's one of the places that is one of the most Christian nations in the world. So that respect, that was very much on my mom's side. I think that's why she probably took us toward church. She just knew that it was, that her culture was very much more like the group before the individual. It's going to take a community. I think that like she knew that instinctively. So that was one of the things that she sort of brought us toward church. Whereas my dad, he moved to the United States when he was 5 years old. And everything that he understood was sort of Western based. Sort of rags to riches, sort of like, I can do anything myself. There's no, like, my choice, I define myself by my ability to produce or to be significant at something. And so everything that he went through was this fight of culture, of race. He moved to the United States when he was really young. And so it's a really interesting mix that sort of poured into me.
So middle school, high school, what's that like for you?
Middle school. So I moved in the middle of middle school a couple times. I went to 2 high schools, 3 middle schools, and 4 different elementaries. And so I didn't know it, but I was constantly trying to reinvent myself and conform myself in a way that I thought that popularity would make me popular, maybe, or make me accepted. So every time I would move, I would sort of take on a lot of the culture and sort of just absorb it, and then sort of fit right in. But I moved to California when I was a sophomore in high school, and at that point, I was only defining myself by the culture of the time, which was very much a party culture. I moved to California, and it was interesting because my school, when I moved to California, I moved from a school that was maybe there was like 12 Asian people, out of 1,500 or 2,000 kids, and then I moved to a school that was 33% Asian and had 3,500 kids. So I went from being like sort of too Asian for the white people, and then I was too white for the Asian people when I moved. It was just really, so I just continued to not feel accepted. Actually, funny story, the first group of people that really I made friends with when I moved to California were these small group of African American students that went to this high school. So we would, I think that you're just always going to gravitate to where the love is, wherever you find it, good or bad. And at that point in high school, I started to gravitate toward a party culture. I moved to this area that was pretty affluent, but you had a lot of students who were doing whatever they wanted to. And you had a lot of parents who were saying, you can do whatever you want to as long as you stay in the house. So we don't care what you do, as long as you do it here. We know you're safe. So they would let their kids drink. They would let their kids party. They would, I don't even remember where these parents were. I knew they were in the house sometimes, but we would be throwing these huge parties, So I very much in high school learned the lie that was going to affect the next quarter century of my life, which is that there's fun and then there's drugs and alcohol fun. Like in order to achieve the next level of fun, I had to have drugs and alcohol,
So I think it's interesting to talk about the relationship with drugs and alcohol, right?
Sure.
So as a person in recovery myself, I can look all the way back on my history and see that my relationship to drugs and alcohol was different than my peers. Where the vast majority of the students that I was around were using drugs and alcohol, I used them differently. So what was your relationship with drugs and alcohol different right out of the gate, or did that develop over time? And how prevalent was it when you were younger, high school age?
I think that immediately my relationship was different with it because it was going back to what we just talked about, I always felt a little outside. I always felt a little other than. I always felt like that green alien. It never really went away. And drugs and alcohol gave me this false sense of like everything is okay. You're okay. It really became this sense of strength and courage. And then beyond it being a reward, it was never like a reward. It was an operating system, It was like, okay.
I do know.
Yeah, yeah, you know what I'm saying? And so it was assigned to me in a way that I was like, oh, I can function under this. Not knowing how dangerous it was, not ever really understanding my mortality in it. At that point, I had not had a lot of loss. I mean, I went for the majority of my life not experiencing death. Because I never met my grandparents, because this immigrant experience, I didn't lose anybody until I had the greatest tragedy, right? So, which is God's plan too. Yeah.
So where's the moment where you recognize that you've got a problem?
Oh man, I don't think I recognized I had a problem for many, many years. So most of my life, I tried to become a more functional addict. So I would bump into something, I would suffer a consequence, and I'd be like, oh, I'm not going to do that again. All right, I won't drive when I'm drunk. I just won't do that, I'll get DUI and come back, bump this way, get in trouble, and go, oh, won't do that. I won't carry my stash around with me, I just took the lessons that I was being handed, the consequences, right? Oh, I won't do that. I won't tell my girlfriend about this because it ruined that relationship, Oh, well, I will just hide this from my parents, Like I just took everything that probably should have been a lesson about understanding. I refused to accept that this was not a relationship that I could tame. I refused to accept that my relationship with drugs was something that defined me. I just saw it as like as an appendage, like it was part of me. You know what I'm saying? Like giving up drugs and alcohol would be like asking you to cut off your hand, and you're just like, well, that's crazy. Who would cut off your hand? So I think I had very much unknowingly fused my identity with my use of drugs in a way that, like, when you talk about identity as, function of identity is defining yourself, right? I think on some level I had defined myself in the vacuum of not having any kind of spiritual health, in the vacuum of not having a authority figure that was, and I don't say this, poor me kind of way, but I did not have an authority figure who was either completely competent or completely caring. They did their best. They were wonderful. I love them, and we're continuing to grow, all of us. But in that vacuum, I just sort of made my own cleverness and my ability to see the gray in all things become this operating system.
So as your relationship with drugs and alcohol got deeper and deeper and got, using your words, fused with your identity, where was God?
God was on the shelf. God was as far away. I was kicking the can down. So I grew up in the church, heard the gospel. Even at that point when I was a young child, received the gospel, or said I received the gospel, right? I remember being 11 years old and having a little sprinkle baptism, and the pastor asking me, do you believe you're a child of God? Do you accept Jesus into your life? And I remember saying yes to that. Although I think it was all head knowledge and none of it was heart knowledge. So all of that was ministering to my brain, but I was so, I spent my whole life trying to keep things from overwhelming my heart. Even my drug use was this numbing effect because I did not know how to process feelings. I didn't know what feelings were. I thought they were something they were kind of a weakness. I thought that sometimes maybe, I think that unknowingly, as I became more manipulative, I knew that feelings were someplace that I could get what I wanted from people. So I spent a lot of time running from those feelings. And so when you're asking the question, where was God? I was just running from God. So I did not know. I was sort of this agnostic person. Maybe I was a bit of a deist, someone who goes, oh, well, maybe there's a God. But I had no relation to him. I was trying to run from him. I didn't want to think about it because I was like, well, how can anyone know if there's really a God? So for me, God, the closest thing that I could define God as, the Cliff Notes of the Bible for me, the things that did stick was that God is love, And so for me, I just tried to kind of understand it through that lens, like God is love. So then I tried to I went on this, the majority of my life trying to understand the concept of love without really understanding the concept of God. So my love for my family, my love for stuff, my love for my own ambition, my love for my own significance.
So let's shift gears a little bit.
Yeah.
Tell us how your siblings fit into your story.
Okay. So my siblings are such an integral part of my story in many ways. First and foremost, I have a little sister, and she's much younger than me. So when my dad came out of prison, he was happy to see my mom, and they had my sister. My sister's 13 years younger than me, though, right? So that's the nicest way to put that. Up to the point of my addiction, when I really realized I had problems, the only thing that I had in my life that I felt like I grounded me was my relationship with my sister. Because as things got more challenging with my parents actually ended up splitting up after many years. I had this relationship with this little girl, and I was just really honest and open with her. I really tried to pour in her and let her know that, like, please, 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 the things that I've been going through, witness these things and don't do them yourself. And that was able to keep me on the straight and narrow for different parts of my life for short stints, right? So very much any kind of healthy habits that I did build outside of Jesus and outside of recovery was through the lens of, like, my family. And then there's my younger brother, Young Ghun. So, Young Min was my best friend. He was someone who helped me to understand the world in a way, like when you're that close to someone. So, I talk about my story and about moving and all these things you go through. Well, there was one person who went through all that with me, and that's my brother. And my brother, also, though, we both struggled with drugs and alcohol. I don't know how much of that came from our growing up together and me experiencing a lot of these things with him. Sometimes I used to feel kind of really guilty about that, that like maybe I introduced him into this lifestyle. I said, hey, partying is great, drugs are great. But we did end up sort of living in different parts of the country for a little while. And at some point, my brother got saved and found Jesus. And he probably spent the last maybe 10 years of his life trying to get me to come back to Jesus, talking to me about Jesus.
While still struggling.
Yeah.
But he was struggling in two different directions, right? He was struggling with the Lord on one side, and he was struggling with his habits on the other side.
Yeah, he used to call it his demon, and he used to say, I got this demon, this thing that like I can't, shake, and I don't know how much, your relationships become these enabling things too. They start to devolve into these things where like there's no boundaries anymore. There's no healthy boundaries. So if he's doing good and I'm not doing good, or I'm doing good and he's not doing good, and there's no blame there. I'm just saying that like, our addiction and our relationship started to revolve around addiction as much as anything else. We would go get drugs together. We would get high together. We would, hang out at my mom's house,
And it's easy to discount what somebody's saying about the Lord when they're simultaneously getting high with you.
Yes, I think so. But I think also he would go through these things where I would know exactly when he was struggling because he would stop going to church. I would know immediately when something was up with him. He just had no ability to hide it. I mean, not that any of us do eventually, but he very much continued to try to understand Jesus, and I think it's interesting because as I'm starting to grow as a Christian, I see that I'm still learning from him in a weird way, because I'm learning from the things that he did well. To his strength, we all have strengths and weaknesses, and I think that I'm just starting to understand that part of it. But so my brother, he tried to get me to come back to Jesus. He would ask me to come to Jesus, and excuse me, sorry. I get a little emotional, I think. I would just go round and round with him. I'd be like, oh, please, can we just not talk about this? I would tell him things like, oh, I'm spiritual. I'm not religious. I don't, but years later, I realized that was like the one place that this truth was still coming at me. And he was the only person who I respected enough and loved enough that I would even wrestle with these questions. So he was like this ember that was sort of keeping the fire going. I don't even think I knew that at the time. And that maybe in a way he was sort of getting things percolating in the back of my brain. So what happens is on March 17th, 2015, and my brother had been doing very well, actually. And then through a relapse, one morning, my mom came upon my brother, and he had passed away. He had died of a drug overdose of fentanyl. And I remember waking up in the middle of the night and my mom yelling out my brother's name in a way that, just the way I heard it, I knew from that moment like something terrible had happened. So I run upstairs and we find my brother, and there's so many things going on through my head in this moment. And First of all, my brother is laying in a spot where he had saved my life maybe 18 months previously. I had overdosed in the exact spot he was in, and he had managed to save my life by finding me in time, getting me to the hospital, them giving me Narcan. And so it was this weird thing where my mom was almost like just assuming that this was going to kind of go down the same way. But he was clearly in a place that he had been expired for a while. And it was a really challenging time, calling the ambulance, waiting for them to get there. And so once we knew he was gone, in that moment, I did this one thing that I had not done for most of my life. So at that point, I'm like 40 something, 41 maybe, 40, or 2015 actually. So I'm, I don't know, 39.
Late 30s.
Yeah, late 30s. And I had stopped going to church when I was maybe 12, 13. So for 30, almost 30 years, I had not prayed. I had not said a prayer. And finding his body there, being so overwhelmed, not knowing what to do, in that moment, I did the one thing, first and foremost, I knew he would want me to do, I did the one thing I knew how to do. I didn't know what to do. I just got down on my knees and I prayed over his body. I said a prayer out loud in front of my mom. I said it with my mom. I said it in front of the paramedics who are like still walking around, the house in their gear. In that moment, when I was going through such shock and agony, I did the one thing that my whole life had prepared me to do, was just say this prayer to God. And I didn't realize it, but in that moment, something changed, because I in that moment knew that there was a God. I knew that I wasn't him, right? Because I would have done anything to bring my brother back. And something shifted inside of me. It was just the beginning. Now, I had to go through a bunch of other chapters after that to kind of still understood what that meant, right? So my brother passed away that day, and I was in this fog of grief, And so what began to happen then is I went on this journey, this spiritual journey, to figure out, what does it mean that there's a God? What does it mean that my brother passed away? Do I have to follow the same path as he went on, Much later on, his death represented something much different to me. For instance, my brother was 33 years old when he died. He's the second person, I always say, that was 33 years old to die for me. So I understand. So Jesus was the same age as my brother when he passed away. So so in a very real way, I understood. I was like, wow, Jesus died when he was my brother's age. And like, I would have done anything to have my brother back. And then to understand that Jesus came back to life, I was like, whoa. One of the other things that is so hard about losing a brother is in the middle of the night, I would hear my mom. I would hear her in Korean, like 4 o'clock in the morning. She'd say, "어디가 영문아, 어디가," which means like, where have you gone? Where have you gone, Young Ghun? Right? Heartbreaking. But in that moment, I realized like a parent's love for their son. I realized like how much it broke my mom to lose her son, and it hit me in a way that like I understand in a very real way what it's like for God to send his son for me to die, right? So all these lessons that are still coming up about my brother and how it defines me. So at one point, a church member in my brother's church had tried to send my brother to Overcomers. Overcomers is, of course, Miracle Hill's 7-month program. And he had not accepted for a myriad of reasons. I think he went to another program, a secular program or something. And so they got in contact with me. They did my brother's funeral. They were very kind to me. They would check in on me. There are two very wonderful parts of our Miracle Hill family, Drew and Penny Kroll.
Yeah, shout out to Drew and Penny Kroll.
Yeah, absolutely. And so they would just sort of check in with me every once in a while. And then as things just kind of continued to progress, at some point they were like, hey, we want to make the same offer to you as we did for your brother. And maybe, if you're willing. And then that's how I got introduced to Greenville, South Carolina.
Yeah, so quick sidebar. So Drew volunteered at the children's home like 40 years ago and befriended Reed and has been friends all these many years. And Drew and Penny have sent dozens of men and women to Overcomers and Renewal. One of the guys who came through, Steve Barkey, whom we both know, a close personal friend of mine, is doing great today. I mean, it's just amazing the full circle of how God has used these relationships connected to Miracle Hill to continue to bring people from Colorado of all places.
Yeah.
So you get to South Carolina. To the deep South.
I had never. Okay, so I lived in Alabama at one point, but I had not been to the South. So they were like, "Look, we know this place in Greenville, South Carolina." I had never heard of Greenville. I was like, "What?" So there's that part in the Bible like Abraham went without knowing where he was going to receive it. That was me, 100%. I was like, okay. But at that point, I was at the beginning of my surrender. You just like at the end of yourself, where you're finally like, if you are willing, make me clean, Lord, or just like I will give this my honest effort to whatever this is. And so that's how I ended up showing up here.
So at what point do you know that you know Jesus?
That's such a great question. So Jesus had been trying to reach me through so many interactions, both ones that I was aware of and ones that I was completely unaware of. But the ones that I were aware of, once I got to Greenville, I was praying to the Lord. I was just like, God, if you are real, can you make yourself, can I encounter you in a way? Can you help me? Can you show me something? And for me, the way that it worked, coming back and starting to hear the truth of the gospel, starting to answer questions about who Jesus was, very much felt like coming home in a way that I did not expect it to. It was sort of like, it felt like my first language, right? Like I was like, oh, I understand. I think oh my goodness. And I was so hungry for truth at that point. The very first thing that sort of affected me was just starting to read through Proverbs and understanding the wisdom that's in that, and then starting to read through the Gospels. And there was some point, Overcomers is split up into 4 levels. There's a pre-program, and then there's somewhere during level 1, so about maybe 6 to 7 weeks after being at Overcomers.
Dave Niebuhr's class,
yes. But even before that, I had gone to a service, and a man named Big Fred had talked about we're never meant to live in a broken world. And he started to shift my worldview. But we were sitting in class, and we were going over the 3rd book of John, and we were talking about Nicodemus goes to speak to Jesus in the middle of the night. And of course, John 3:16 is in there. And somewhere in there, I just had this question. I was like, wait, so Nicodemus was a real person? And they were like, yes. I was like, he's like a historical person that we can say existed. And they're like, yes. And so this historical person met with Jesus, and there was something about me accepting that Jesus was a real human being that really lived on this earth, and the implications of that. Like, what does that mean? And everything came flooding at me, right? Like, I was like, oh, this is not a theoretical thing. This is not even, you know what I'm saying? This is not hypothetical. This is not folklore, right? I think that there's that argument that C.S. Lewis goes about liar, lunatic, or
Lord.
Well, I had made another L, which is legend. I didn't know that, but I had kind of like, maybe it's a legend or something. But when I realized, I was like, oh my goodness, there are real people that really talk to Jesus. Jesus was here. I need it just all hit me at once. And like I can very much remember like being in class and like everything like going into that wah 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 wah, you know, one of those moments where I was like, oh, and I had that moment where I was so genuinely repentant, and understanding like, oh my goodness, this is real. I have made a terrible error up until this point. I need to I need to make this decision right now. So that's kind of where it happened. I don't think I told anybody. I think it just happened. And I wrestle with this question about like, oh, I don't know. Was I saved when I was younger? Was I not saved? And then I see people wrestling with that same question now. And I go, oh, I just try to stop them. I go, what do you believe now?
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, right? And that's something that I realized too. It's like, it doesn't matter. It's like, what do you believe now? What do you actually believe? You know, do you believe that Jesus came down? Do you believe that he can free you from the penalty of sin, from the power of sin, and someday from the presence of sin, right? What do you believe? You know, and then getting down to that is the nitty gritty of it. So I guess that's when I really knew that I knew.
That you knew. Okay, so we could belabor overcomers for a while, but we're just going to shift gears and we're going to talk about what you've learned through the process. So I'm going to ask you some thought-provoking questions.
Okay.
Because I think oftentimes when you talk about recovery in Christian circles, it gets a bad rap, and people have a poor understanding of what recovery is. So what is recovery?
What a great question. What is recovery? So we can approach this question from multiple different directions, right? And I do know that you're going to ask me about recovery with Jesus, right? So let's just start. I would say, let's just talk about definitions first, right?
Okay.
So if you're going to use the word recovery, you would say the process of healing, right? Or you would say maybe some people also have a recovery ship, you know, someone who goes down underneath the bottom of the ocean and like finds treasure. So maybe recovery can also be finding something that you have lost. Do you know who came up with the term recovery? Do you know where it comes from?
No, and I don't particularly like it.
I don't like it either. That was so interesting. I think, look, that's my point. I'm getting to that.
So I think that what happens at Overcomers and Renewal is discovery. Right? Like another word that I think is misused is rehabilitation. Rehabilitation presumes that you were once habilitated. So I think that what happens at Overcomers is discovery and habilitation, which gets you to a place where you can maybe recover what was once lost, or maybe you're discovering something you never had before.
That's so true. And that's something I was talking about. It's like so much of the process of recovery is the habitualization of showing up. Like you have to habitualize being able to just be open, honest, and transparent in the moment. You have to be a person who relearns your entire MO. This is the way you do things. So for me, let's talk about, so recovery is a process, is a discovery. I think that is a much better term. It's discovering hope, joy, peace. It's rediscovering freedom, from
or discovering freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that a lot of people in the secular world, and this is not to besmirch them, but maybe they find sobriety, but you can be sober and miserable. You can be sober and a liar. You can be sober and, be someone who is a terrible person, and you don't really have freedom. Like the only source of freedom that lasts is Jesus, right?
Uncle Mark, Mark Alverson, is one of our staff members,
Yes.
Affectionately referred to as Uncle Mark. Uncle Mark would often say, a lot of times we're looking for the fruit when we really need to get to the root, right?
Absolutely.
So you can eliminate the drugs and the alcohol, but then all you have left in the building is a bunch of immature, broken humans who aren't high.
Another thing Uncle Mark says, shout out to Uncle Mark, he talks about recovery in the meta-narrative of like, what is the greatest story of recovery ever? So we are lost to sin. We have no way of being with God forever, to being in fellowship with him and loving him. And he sends us Jesus, who helps recover us, right? So really the greatest story of recovery is one that we're all a part of. which is the story of Jesus, right? The good news of Jesus is really the story of recovery, And so I love that idea too about what recovery is and isn't. It's because I think it's interesting in recovery. I think we get very goal oriented. It's like you said, it's like we worry about the fruit. And then as you go on in recovery, you end up realizing that the struggle is sort of the goal. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
It's not the, you know what I'm saying? And then the struggle changes. And so really recovery is this form of humility, right? It's freedom from pride, I think that recovery, if we look deeper, is really is a form of surrender. I think it's so interesting to think about that. What actually causes us to be in recovery, whether you are struggling with addiction to drugs or alcohol, or whether when you're struggling with anger, or if you're struggling with pride or lust, or whatever your brokenness is, right? Now, my brokenness is very public, so public, and I'm so grateful for that, because if it wasn't, I don't know you know what I'm saying? Other people are struggling with other things that they're terrified to tell people. I was terrified that people were going to find me out, that I was an IV drug user, that I was needing drugs and alcohol to feel normal. And then when that didn't work, I didn't know what I was going to do, But recovery or discovery or rediscovery is that we're all broken people who sort of need help getting unstuck. And so recovery is that process of humbling yourself, asking for help, whether it be from Jesus first and foremost, but from other people. It's this process of surrender, of helping stuck people get unstuck. Is probably the simplest definition I can give it.
It took me years to get to a place where I was thankful for my addiction recovery history.
Sure.
And in many regards, I think that guys such as yourself have it easier than many people that are in the church, right? Because they may be stuck in a sin, but they have no negative consequences. So they don't do anything to ever get unstuck. They might be stuck in a sin for 50 years.
Absolutely.
And not even recognize that they're stuck in a position of brokenness.
The best part of my recovery story is the fundamentals, okay? The blocking, the tackling, the basics of it is honesty, is transparency, open honesty. And I'm realizing now that as I interact with my brokenness with people in the church, that we're all the same, and that the best thing I can do is encourage them and model this level of transparency and honesty. Because what happens is we get isolated. Whether you get isolated through addiction to drugs and alcohol, or you get isolated to addiction to pornography, or you get isolated just because you don't know how to have healthy relationships and stability, it's isolation. And that isolation is exactly fertile ground for the devil, for the world, for all these terrible things to come at you.
Yeah, the isolation is so key. So going back earlier in your story, we were talking about being part of the party crowd.
Yes.
So for those of you that are maybe struggling out there, if you think that you're part of the party crowd, but there's nobody at the party, you're probably not part of the party crowd.
Sure.
You're probably in some form of isolated use. So what do you believe is the most important aspect of recovery for somebody to understand who's new to recovery?
So someone who's new to recovery, there's a couple things that I was thinking about. And there's this interesting component of information versus revelation. And I know it's kind of a deep concept, but I think that God brings revelation, and a lot of us have a lot of information, there's a lot of information coming out. But to understand that, what was really revealed to you, about being honest, about your brokenness, about what is the essential component that you need to allow God, that you need to bring to the Lord. I think that so much of that we get this sort of goal oriented, like you said. I think that on the front end, it's so important to understand it's actually something you said to me too. Is a good way to put it. You don't have to do anything. You just have to be, right? It's so important that that you continue to just focus on being that good soil, that fertile soil that God can do something with. And so what does that look like in your life? What are the little things you have to do that? Who are the people speaking into your life to help, keep you accountable, to help keep you in check? What are the things that you're trying to present in a way? What areas are you trying to clean up, So I just think that like it's so important. And I guess this is an example. Like, so you could ask a room full of people who use drugs, how many people know that smoking crack is bad? And like all of them would raise their hand, right? Well, how many people have continued to struggle with that, right? Many of them would raise their hand. So even though they know it's bad, they continue to struggle with it. So the some of us that have been through some recovery program, or been through recovery, or are working on our discipleship, or working to grow to be more like Christ, the Lord has absolutely revealed things either through His Word or through the Holy Spirit or through godly mentors or godly people, and I think that we just go right past that too quickly sometimes.
Yeah, you used a specific word. You said they still struggle with that, and that's part of the problem, right? So people often come into recovery. I think most people come into recovery thinking that somebody is going to teach them how to beat their addiction.
Yeah.
And the point of the steps is, I'm no good, God is good, I think I'll put Him in control.
Yes.
Right? Nobody's going to teach you how to beat drugs and alcohol. What we want to learn is submission to a higher power, in our case, Jesus Christ,
yes,
who can be in control,
yes,
who can beat whatever issue that it is that you're facing in this world.
I mean, so the Bible says, like, if you're humble, at the right time, He will exalt you, right? Kind of, paraphrasing. But, and so many of us think, like, what is that exalting? What does that mean? I'm going to get a good job. I'm going to, I have found that that's not, first of all, that's not my part to worry about, right? I need to focus on the humble part. And I get these moments in my life now that are so fill my heart. Okay, so I have these moments with my friends. Even you're included in this, where we're children, right? They have children, and these children will run up to me and give me a hug and say, Uncle Young, Uncle Jen, right? And that moment of watching that child run up to me and hug me, and me having this revelation, like, oh my goodness, how far has my life come? There's no way just a few years ago that I would even be in this position where a child, number one, where people would trust me around their children. Number two, where a child could come up to me and I could feel like I deserved this hug, and I could just be in this moment and receive this love of this child. That is like, oh my goodness, that is what like God will give you these moments that you're like, wow. I was talking to the students at I work with the youth group at my church now, right? And at Rocky Creek, and I was talking to them and talking to these students, and in the middle of it, I realized that, like, yes, I had lost a little brother, and in the Lord's grace and mercy, He has given me hundreds of new little brothers, new little sisters, like just new siblings. In this moment, I had a moment, like in the middle of like talking to these kids, and I go, wow. And that only came because on the front end, I just focused on the work and I let the change take care of itself. I let God take care of the change.
And their love is so reflective of Christ's love.
Yes.
They love you for you.
Yes.
Not for what you do.
No.
Not for your brokenness.
No.
Not for your faults and failures,
yes,
or the way that you look. They love you just because you are you.
If I asked your kids, I was like, hey, what do you love about your dad, right? They would never say, well, because he's the CEO of Miracle Hill, or because he did this, or because they would not define anything. They would say, because he's nice to me, because he loves me, because he's my dad,
Yeah, I actually asked my son that last night, what he loved about his mom. And he said that he loved her because, he loved flowers. He loved his mom because she smelled good and because she drives him places.
That's awesome.
Yep, drives us places. That's that sinful nature coming out, the selfishness. Okay, so we're getting close to our time here, so I'm going to skip a couple of these questions. Let's go biblical for a minute.
Yeah.
what does John 3:30 mean for recovery? So John 3:30, he must increase, I must decrease.
Someone explained to me once about this verse that you could not flip it. It shouldn't be like, you couldn't be like, I must decrease, so he must increase. Like the way it reads is the inerrant, inspired word of God, right? So he must increase and I must decrease. For me, that means that the only way for me to battle a desire is with a greater desire. And as I allow God to really fill me, and as he becomes the principal, okay, so another thing, let's go back to this recovery question, and like we're going to go biblical. The one verse I had down today, which I really think is so crucial to recovery and is him increasing my life, is Romans 12:1 and 2, which is, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So all of those things don't really happen unless he becomes greater and greater and I become less and less. It is this process that actually is the way that we are designed. We're designed to worship something, and you become what you worship. And so the fascinating thing is, as you surrender more and more and just allow him to become greater and greater, it's really the process that frees us from ourselves.
So 2 more questions. We'll be done.
Okay.
So talk to the people that have never struggled with substance abuse. How should they think about the concepts of recovery?
So first and foremost, I think that too many people who haven't struggled with recovery think of behavior modification. They tend to put the first of all, it's a very hard thing to love an addict. I know that. I mean, I've done a lot of, I put my family in a lot of situations, and so I think a lot of times unknowingly people make it about themselves in a way that's really not healthy, or in a lot of ways it's not fair to them. If you just loved me more, you would quit. How could you possibly put me through this if you loved me? Can't you see this is doing terrible things? Can't you just see what this is doing to your children and to your family and to me? So that kind of thinking, that personalization of someone else's brokenness, is really not helpful. In a way that, it's not helpful for you to set a boundary that is healthy. It's not helpful. It's not really even real, because the habitualization or whatever I've done to become enslaved to drugs and alcohol had everything to do with me and my brokenness, and so in a weird kind of way, just putting that kind of pressure is just driving a wedge between us, right? I think that people who don't know about recovery need to know that in order for someone to change, real heart change has to take place. So,
and you can't force someone to change their heart.
No, not at all. And so, because the only way you get through recovery is if you, with an approach of discipline, you got to reorder. You have to, you're looking at your priorities. It's not just about goals. So everybody thinks that we're going to rise to the level of our goals. The truth is that you fall to the level of your systems. And so if your system is not based on something greater than yourself, if your system is not built, and as believers in Jesus, our system is this rock solid truth that God loved me so much that he refused to be God without me, and that he sent his son to die for me so that I could have him in my life, so I could have him as a friend, so I could have him as a savior, so that I could have the Spirit of God inside of me to help me, and so the wonderful thing is that if you do not know about recovery, the first thing is you tend to make it about you. And it's not about you. The best thing you could do is set very clear boundaries. People need to have consequences. Consequences need to happen. God loves us and disciplines us because he loves us, right? And that consequence is designed to bring humility in your life.
That's a whole nother podcast,
It
right?
is a
We
whole-
could
yeah.
have a whole nother
absolutely.
conversation about boundaries as the grace.
I think we need to have it at some point.
So, are the principles of recovery just for somebody with substance abuse problems?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think everybody needs to go. First of all, like we said, the story of recovery is the story of Jesus, right? The principles of recovery, I think if we are all taking an honest look at ourselves, we know that we're all sinners. We all are sinners saved by his grace. We all are in need of Jesus. Some of our sin patterns present themselves in a way which are very much more public.
Or destructive.
But I would argue that the wages of sin are death, and that like the ones that don't seem as destructive might be equally destructive. You know, we could get into an interesting conversation about that. But the thing about recovery that I love, which is the same things that I love about the Christian life, is that there's a level of honesty and openness and being fully reliant on God. That is so apparent to someone who's going through recovery, right? We believe in a faith-based 12-step system over at Overcomers, and one of the steps that I really like is step 3, which is we made a decision to turn our lives and our will over to God as we understood him. So we made a decision to turn our lives and our will to God, right? That decision has to be made by everybody. It has to absolutely be made by everybody.
Made by everybody and made every day.
Made every day.
And oftentimes made 50 times a day.
Absolutely. We decided to give our will and our lives. So that the reason I read Romans 12 is this whole idea about a living sacrifice. When you're really presenting your life as a living sacrifice, every bit of your life is worship. Right?
So let's go to the end of the story.
Please do.
So you're several years clean at this point.
I am between 3 and 4 years clean. So
Okay.
yeah, praise God.
What's your life look like today?
So interestingly enough, some things are closing, that things are changing and shifting. I very much am very involved in my church. I worry about people who go through the recovery process or who go through Overcomers and then feel like they can do this sort of solo Christian thing. I don't know what that is. I don't know where they learn that. I think that one of the hardest things to get people to move toward is this component of relationships. I don't think it's an automatic thing. I think what happens is you go into Overcomers and it's sort of like you're sort of forced in community and you realize how wonderfully healthy it is and it helps you grow. And then the minute you get out, you start to isolate again. So my relationship right now, my life right now looks like it's very full of mentors and people. The number one indicator for long-term success in recovery is actually mentors. Did you know that?
I did know that.
Yeah. The number 2 thing is transitional living.
Right.
So my life right now is very much about mentors, transitional living. I'm a mentor collector. I just literally, I'm so grateful that I have all these men. I don't make decisions really. I just have this sort of life board. And when I have a big decision making, including right now, I'm in a relationship. I'm in a healthy relationship with a woman, and we are, I even asked all my friends about that. I was like, "Is it time? Is it time?" And there was a time when they were like, "No, it's not time." And then when it was, they were like, "Yeah, this is great. This is a good time." So right now I'm going to school, and I'm just trying to put Jesus at the center of everything. So right now Jesus is at the center of my job. He's at the center of my work. He's at the center of my school. He's at the center of my relationship. He's and that's not always easy. Like I get worried about doing these podcasts and talking about this because I have not arrived. I will never arrive. I am so full of struggle and brokenness every day still. But I finally have a system or don't even want to call it that. I don't even know. What do you call it? I finally have the truth. I finally have something that is greater than myself that I can lean on, and that continues to center me, and that continues to give me a truth. I tried to operate for most of my life, like I said, running from God. And the only way that this world makes sense to me is by understanding that this is his world and it's his rules, and he has a way which is better than my way, and he has thoughts that are greater than my thoughts.
Okay, last question. You
Yeah.
have the ear of somebody out there that is struggling with addiction, and this may be the only person in recovery that they ever talk to. What do you want to say to them?
I want to say that there are only two kinds of people out there: people who have hope and people who need hope. And if you're a person who needs hope, God loves you, Jesus loves you, and he has not given up on you. He wants you to have that hope. So don't give up.
Amen. Thank you for coming in and spending some time with me today.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you to our listeners for checking out the podcast. You can learn more about Miracle Hill by going to miraclehill.org. And everybody, have a blessed day.
Thanks for joining us on the Miracle Hill podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, subscribe, and share on your platform of choice. You can also visit us on our website, miraclehill.org, to find out more about us and how you can support us in our mission. We can't wait for you to join us again next time.